Hey, happy Friday, y'all. We are getting started, rolling right into the 1980s. Uh, some things before we get started, though. The retest is going to be available for you on Schoology, but we're not going to have a dedicated class for us to take that, so you're going to need to do it on your own time. If you want to wait until I return next week and I can review your answers before you submit it, that's fine. But today you're going to need a notebook to take notes and a review sheet that you should have picked up on your way in. So take a look at this bell ringer. What location did President Carter hold secret negotiations with the president of Egypt and Israel's prime minister? The White House, Camp David, the Pentagon, or the Statue of Liberty? All right, make sure you got that bell ringer in your notebook. All right, y'all. Today we are looking at Reagan. Reagan is going to be the president of the 80s, get him for 8 years, and makes a lot of changes to U.S. economic policy and really set the stage for the world that we're living in. All right, so we're going to be looking at Reaganomics and be able to ask if it was successful, looking at today's trends, and why was there conservative resurgence in the 1980s? All right, so the 70s sees the end of Jimmy Carter's run as president. He will run for re-election in 1980, but he is he's got the struggling economy, stagflation with you know high levels of inflation, high levels of taxes, low unemployment, uh, costs are going up, hostages are still uh, in Iran. He's got a very low approval rating, so pretty much destined to lose, and he's going to face an opponent that's quite charismatic and able to defeat him. And that is going to be Ronald Reagan. All right. The election of 1980 is a sweep. Uh, Reagan takes the Electoral College overwhelmingly, even getting some reliable conservative states like New York. And as fate would have it, the moment he completes his inaugural address, the hostages in Iran are released. All of a sudden, Ronald Reagan is starting to build this character of this great conservative savior moving forward. He ends up winning by an even larger margin again in 1984. His vice president is George H.W. Bush, where we have our presidential library here in town. And that's going to put him 8 years square in the middle of the 80s. And in fact, HW will become president and win that 1988 election. So we're going to have a run of Republican presidents here. But a bit about Reagan. Uh, he was known as the great communicator. He had a job as an actor, so he knew how to speak to people, how to connect with people. He was a union leader and then famously a governor of California. And he is one of the presidents to put onto the list who saw an assassination attempt early in his presidency. So to understand why Reagan was such a overwhelming victor in this presidency, we have to look at the conservative resurgence. Right? When we look at what we have just studied, the 60s and the revolution that was happening then, with the hippie movement into the 70s, we had an explosion of government spending with the Great Deal. That wasn't everybody in the 60s and 70s wasn't hippie, and not everybody was living that kind of lifestyle. There's a large amount of pushback from more conservative Christian groups of people, and they saw that the government was growing too fast, too quickly, and they wanted to see the government take a step back from people's lives. And Reagan is really able to capitalize on this. And some pieces to this conservative resurgence were these organizations that backed Ronald Reagan. One of these is the Moral Majority. So this is a group of conservative religious people who believe that America should return to Christian values, nuclear home, fathers at work, mothers generally staying home, not necessarily like stay at home and do that kind of work, but far more traditional. And they mobilized, and they are able to get a lot of funding and a lot of support for Reagan and get him elected. When I think moral majority, sometimes I also correlate this with the silent majority. If you can remember Richard Nixon running and winning his presidential election in the 60s on the idea of the silent majority of Americans that wanted to continue to support the South Vietnamese through the Vietnamese War. Now we're rolling again with the same conservative group, but now it's a moral majority. In fact, most people aren't hippies. They're not trying to change the way America was founded and on this idea of a Christian and nuclear family background. So, and it appeals to a lot of people, and they have a lot of influence on which way people are going to vote. The Heritage Foundation also supports the Republican conservative drive, and they're going to support Ronald Reagan. And give you an idea, think tank, it's a body of experts who do research and they start to advocate for public policy. They almost always align politically left or right, but their research is evidence-based and it's respected. It's legit research. But they are largely funded by major corporations or very wealthy people. So they can start to skew things to favor an outcome that's going to be more popular with a conservative or with a more liberal base, depending on which way that foundation is being funded. But they're very, very influential in helping policy be passed, writing laws, and that kind of thing. A very powerful group with a lot of money and a lot of influence is the National Rifle Association, and they are a gun rights advocacy group. They teach firearm safety, competency, safe gun ownership, but they also have an immense amount of influence in Washington through lobbying. And lobbying is where corporations, interest groups, I mean, think any major company or group of people are going to be part of some form of a lobbying group. And so the NRA is going to be part of one of these lobbying groups. And a lobbyist is someone who represents that group. So they represent retired people, teachers, doctors, hospitals, oil companies, car companies, manufacturing, sugar, like everything that you can imagine. There are people who are registered as lobbyists, and they get close to politicians. They try and push certain bills. They try and fund people who they think are going to be able to pass legislation and pass laws that are going to help the people that they represent. And they use their influence to sway government, and in a very large way. And This can be looked at through two lenses of a positive outlook of lobbying is all things being equal, each side gets to lobby and try and pass new laws. People have more of a voice in government because you can participate in these things. It's really excellent to have this in government. Another side of that coin can be that lobbyists are more powerful the larger their group. They have more influence, they have more money. So these richer groups and richer lobbyist groups can cast a larger shadow and have more influence in government action. So a good side of a coin, yeah, all things being equal, everybody's just trying to have their voice heard. The other side is the only voices being heard are the very rich and powerful voices, and it's not equal in this idealistic situation. The moral majority is no longer an active group, but the NRA is, and is the Heritage Foundation. They technically can't lobby, but they do lobby through another wing. It's a very shady way to influence elections with massive amounts of money. Sandra Day O'Connor, she's a really interesting story. She's going to be the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. It's a promise that Ronald Reagan had made that he would put a woman on the Supreme Court. And Sandra Day O'Connor, a great story. She's born in 1930 in El Paso and grows up in rural Arizona. And when she's 16, she goes to Stanford and she gets a law degree by the time she's 22. Just an incredible accomplishment. Consider the young age. She's getting to Stanford in 1946. So World War II is just coming to a close. It's an amazing time for a woman to be at Stanford getting her law degree by the time she's 22. It's an incredible accomplishment for a woman during that age. If you see her graduation photo, I don't have it up here, but it's her and then all men that graduate from the law school. But she struggles to find a job as an attorney, as you can imagine, during that time. So she opens up a storefront law office, gets involved in politics, becomes a state senator, and then becomes a judge, and ultimately in 1980 is appointed to the Supreme Court as first woman. Next, we're going to look at Reagan's economic policies and something that still has an immense amount of influence on the way we try and operate our economy now. And it's something that I hope that you look at to where you can maybe determine if you think we're headed in a good direction or not when it comes to what we do with taxes and interest rates and how we try and fight inflation. But thinking of when Reagan is coming into office and what we just talked about through the 1970s of stagflation, where you have high unemployment and high inflation, he's starting to look at the solution to being less government. He says that big government causes more problems than it fixes. And he's campaigning on this. Government isn't the solution, it's the problem. We need to free up market. Because free market equals free people. And you let the market make people wealthy, and people don't need to rely on the government. And so through cutting taxes and cutting regulations, he is going to try and grow private business. All right, so let's take a look at this video, and I'm hoping that the audio is going to come through for y'all on this.
Reaganomics refers to the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States of America. We're going to take a look at the economic policy that still affects your paycheck to this day. When Ronald Reagan was elected to be the 40th President of the United States in 1980, the nation's economy had been in a state of great inflation since 1965. The decade leading up to Reagan's presidency was characterized by something called stagflation, where prices were rising even as unemployment remained high and economic growth was slow or stalled. This not only damaged the U.S. economy, but economies around the world. Reagan's solution was an economic plan that became to be known by his supporters and critics alike as Reaganomics. Reaganomics was heavily based on the trickle-down theory. This argues that if you lower costs for corporations by cutting their taxes, businesses use those savings to invest. The thinking was more money for corporations would mean more jobs and higher wages for workers and thus increased spending. But trickle-down is a controversial idea. Opponents argue that when corporate taxes are cut, domestic social programs suffer. And most likely, only a small handful of rich individuals at the top become even richer. Reaganomics wasn't just about tax cuts. The policy had three other central points: deregulating businesses, turning government services over to private contractors, and decreasing spending on domestic social programs, including food stamps, Social Security, and disability insurance. During his presidency, Reagan signed two tax bills into law, one in 1981 and the other in 1986. As a combined result of the 1981 and 1986 bills, the top income tax rate was slashed from 70 to 28%, the lowest income tax rates for the rich since the 1920s. Reagan's policies were highly debated, and economists still argue about the pros and cons of Reaganomics in terms of both immediate and lasting effects. Proponents argue that by 1983, the nation's economy had started to recover from stagflation. This led to a period of economic prosperity that continued through the rest of Reagan's presidency, though another recession soon followed after he left office. But critics argue that based on a normal economic cycle, the economy would have recovered from the recession on its own without Reaganomics. Critics also point out that Reaganomics led to larger, not smaller, budget deficits and a larger national debt. Many people say Reagan giving corporate tax cuts while cutting funding for domestic social programs was a policy that favored the rich and led to increased wealth inequality. While Republicans tend to reference Reaganomics as exemplary policies, Democrats almost always bring it up as an example of corporate greed that hurts the middle and working classes. Either way, it remains a defining part of Ronald Reagan's presidency and legacy.
All right, hopefully you all are able to hear that. If not, I will make sure all this is uploaded into Schoology for your review on your own. So this idea of supply side economics and what becomes known as Reaganomics is the idea of you're going to cut taxes. So ideally, everybody has more money in their pocket. Businesses who are going to pay less taxes are going to use that money to reinvest into the business, increase salaries. They start to supply more goods, make more things to people for people to buy. People have more money to be able to buy those things. The economy is stimulated, inflation starts to drop, and the recovery from stagflation is going to be able to be achieved. He makes this plan early in his presidency, and in 1981, he gets on TV. He's got nice, pretty charts. He talks about how he believes that as companies become more and more wealthy, they will use that money to reinvest into their people, and everyone will get richer. This whole idea of a rising tide lifts all ships. But that's going to be pretty hotly debated, and it still very much is, because these tax cuts are going to overwhelmingly favor higher income earners. In fact, you do start to see that if you are in the bottom 5% of income earners, you made less money. And throughout the 1980s, the top 10% of earners see an increase of almost 90% on their income. And over that same course, lower income earners will see their wages rise by maybe 1%. So it does start to favor these large companies more than it favors the workers. Another famous thing is the reduction in federal regulations on businesses. So government, again, is going to step away. We're going to have more laissez-faire. We want to let the market make the determination on what's best. Now, although he did talk about cutting taxes and cutting government spending, he does start to spend an incredible amount of money in the military budget. He is really into the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is also nicknamed the Star Wars program, where they're going to put lasers in outer space, and those lasers would be able to shoot down any intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the deficit of the government explodes like by maybe 180%. It's incredible. But we do see through the mid 80s that inflation starts to reduce and things do appear to be better. Wall Street is doing great. People are making a bit more money, but overwhelmingly the gap between those highest income earners and lowest income earners starts to expand. So let's look at it, y'all. The last question that we need to answer today: what was that theory behind Reaganomics? Are we borrowing from foreign countries? Are we increasing government spending to reduce unemployment? Is it broad tax cuts and financial deregulation? Or a reduction in trade barriers? Make sure you put that mastery check in your notes as well. All right, y'all, that closes out the lesson for today. I hope you enjoy your weekend. Remember, I won't be here again Monday. I will see you all on Tuesday.